Welcome everybody very quickly, and just so you all know, this is a follow-up to the panel discussion that was held at the Connecticut State Capitol at the end of May. So basically, today we're going to be reviewing some of the information that was covered at this roundtable event, and we'll also be speaking more to some state-specific data that we weren't able to get to due to time. And this afternoon, you'll be hearing from several people, myself included. You'll also be hearing from Jim Conway. He is a professor of psychological sciences at Central Connecticut State University. And then you'll also hear from Aileen Keyes-Yeager, who is the project manager for the Connecticut Children with Incarcerated Parents initiative. So before we start with our first presentation, I'm just going to mention a few housekeeping things. So you should all be able to type in questions. We are going to be seeing them throughout this whole broadcast, but just so you know, we will not actually be answering any questions until about the last 10 minutes. So if something does come up, please feel free to type that in, but just know that we won't be answering them immediately. And secondly, for all who have not made it, or for anybody who does want to share this following the webinar, we will be sending this out in our next newsletter, and we'll also be posting it onto YouTube, I believe. So we will make sure that you get the link to that if you all are interested. So our first presenter today is, as I mentioned, Jim Conway, and he will be talking about the New Britain Courthouse study. So thank you, Jim.
Jim Conway from Psychological Science at CCSU, and I want to share some state-specific data that Eric referred to a couple of minutes ago about effects of parental incarceration on children's daily lives in Connecticut. And I'm already on my second slide now, so let me just pick up there with a brief explanation of why this study was performed. And I just want to make the point, first of all, that parental incarceration can constitute toxic stress for children, toxic stress being stress that is severe enough that the child's not able to adequately cope with it, and that the bodily response is extreme enough that it can actually cause damage and changes in the brain. One issue is that the incarceration of a parent could constitute the loss of an attachment figure, an important adult in the child's life. Another issue, which is kind of difficult for those of us not in this situation to see, is the stigma. It can be really, difficult to deal with, to have a parent incarcerated. Another example is just anxiety and uncertainty by children and their families over court dates and sentencing, and just not knowing what's going to happen to your parents. So there's potentially a strong stress response that can be damaging to children, and this is associated with, there's a fairly decent-sized evidence base that it's associated with negative long-term outcomes, including, just very briefly, physical health problems, mental health problems, behavioral problems, and so that's reasonably well established. What is not really very well known is what are the more immediate effects of a caregiver's arrest on children's lives. For example, what kinds of things are lost from the daily life, things, for example, that the caregiver had been providing and is no longer in a position to provide. So I do want to note that there's been some recent really good work that has started to look at this issue, and what it's focused on is the loss of income, which is certainly a critical issue. But I also want to say that if you think about, like, we as caregivers and what we provide to our children, income may be an important part of it, but there's a lot of other things that we provide. And so, to our knowledge, no research has investigated the full range of different kinds of things that may be lost to children when a parent becomes incarcerated. And certainly there's no data specific to Connecticut, or there wasn't. We're going to present some. But that's the goal of this research. So we decided that more data would be helpful for understanding the effects of incarceration and for developing policies and practices. And around the end of the presentation, I'm going to mention some policy recommendations that we have. But let me tell you what our research questions were, starting with a question about how big an issue this is in Connecticut, like how big is the population. So the research took place at the New Britain Superior Courthouse, and so we used that to frame the question. So one question was how many caregivers are arraigned at the New Britain Superior Courthouse, related question is how many children do they have? So in a given period of time, how many children have an arrested caregiver being arraigned in New Britain? So that was question number 1. Question number 2 is about the demographic profile of the affected families, which includes questions like how many children have a male caregiver versus female caregiver being arraigned, what are the ages of the children, and how many children lived with the arraigned caregiver prior to the arrest. One more I don't have in the PowerPoint, but I want to quickly mention is whether the caregiver was a legal parent or guardian or not. We took a broad definition of what a caregiver is, and it includes oftentimes people who are legal guardians or parents, but not always. So that's question number 2. Question number 3, which is really the central question that motivated the research, is what supports in daily life might children lose when a caregiver is arrested? And we also relatedly wanted to know how the potential loss differs by caregiver's gender, by whether the caregiver is a legal guardian, and whether the children live with the caregiver. So that was our big question. Another pretty important question, number 4, is if a caregiver is arrested, how often do children actually witness the arrest? And what are their experiences when this happens? For example, do they see a weapon used on or pointed at the caregiver? So those are our research questions. Let me move on to describe the methods just really briefly, and I'll get on to the findings, which are the more interesting part. So we had a relatively small sample. We were able to survey 45 caregivers who were at the New Britain Superior Courthouse about the 108 children that they reported they had been caring for in the month prior to their arrest. That's the way that we phrased the questions that we asked them. The caregivers were clients of the Connecticut Public Defender Services, and they were the clients who were held in lockup and who were being arraigned at the courthouse. So that was our sampling frame. A couple of important notes on who we did not include in the sample. One group we did not include was public defender clients who are walk-ins who had been arrested and then released and got themselves to court. And that's an important group, but we didn't have a good way to get access to them. The head public defender at the courthouse estimated that constitutes about 40% of the public defender clients in New Britain. So that's it's a substantial part of the population we did not have access to. Another part of the population we did not get was people arraigned who had private representation, which is a relatively small group. We got an estimate that that's about 10% of the people or caregivers arraigned at the courthouse. But we do have to keep that in mind as we talk about projecting numbers of kids who are affected, that our estimates are really underestimates because we have an important part of the population, but there's some chunks of the population that we don't have. So the survey was actually, it doesn't say this in the PowerPoint, but it was broached to potential survey by their public defender attorney, who asked if they cared for minor children, and if they reported that they did, if they'd be interested in participating in the study. So it was completely voluntary. It would make clear that it would not affect their case in any way. And if they agreed, the survey was administered to caregivers by a researcher in a non-contact interview room either before or after their arraignment. The surveys were actually done at lunchtime when no arraignments were going on. And the period over which the research took place, it started September 2014 and concluded in early March of 2015. So that's just a quick snapshot of the methods, and I'll say a little bit more about the survey questions that we asked as we go through the results. But to move on to the findings, and I'll organize this by research question. For question 1, the issue was the size of the population. So there were 2 parts to this question. First of all, how many caregivers are arraigned at the New Britain Superior Court? So what we did was we took the number of public defender clients who reported that they cared for minor children, whether they participated in the survey or not, kept track of those numbers, and we projected out over a full year. So if we projected out the number of days that the courthouse is open in a year, and the estimate that we got is about 339 caregivers estimated to be arraigned in a year at the New Britain courthouse. The related question of how many children have an arrested caregiver being arraigned, we estimated by taking the number of estimated number of caregivers and then multiplying it by the 2.4 on average children that caregivers reported caring for. So that gives us an estimate in a year of 814 children of caregivers arraigned at the New Britain Superior Court. Which, a couple of notes about those numbers. One is that, as I mentioned a minute ago, they're almost certainly substantial underestimates of the numbers of kids because there are limitations on who was included in our sample. Another note is that what we're really more interested in is statewide information. And there's no way to project from our numbers to what the numbers would be in the entire state of Connecticut, except to say that we're pretty certain the numbers are a lot bigger statewide. So we're talking about, in a given year, a lot of caregivers and a large number of children who are affected by the arrest of their caregiver. And I did make that point, so let me move on to question number 2 about the demographics of the sample. So a few important points here. Just by way of background, the children's mean age was 6.7 years, but there was a lot of variation. And a little less than half are age 5 or below, so that gives us a sense of children's ages. In terms of gender, a little more than half the sample were boys, a little less than half were girls. In terms of their caregiver characteristics, a fairly large majority of the children, 74%, had an arraigned caregiver who was male, and about 26% the arraigned caregiver was female. So primarily a sample with male caregivers, although a substantial number of female caregivers. And in terms of legal guardianship, a large majority, 73%, had a caregiver who was their legal guardian. Those numbers differed a little bit for male versus female caregivers. This difference was actually not statistically significant, but when the caregiver was female, 87 or 86% approximately were legal guardians, and for males it was about 69%. About living arrangements, a little more than just over half the children lived with the arraigned caregiver, which is, when you look at data on incarcerated samples, and this is not a sample of people who are incarcerated, they're held in lockup temporarily while they're being arraigned, but they haven't been sentenced to incarceration. But for incarcerated samples, the numbers are slightly higher than that. For people with children, a little more than half, maybe between 50 and 60%, report that the child was living with them before they became incarcerated. So our numbers are just slightly lower than that. But when you look at the caregiver's gender, it does differ. So for female caregivers, 75% of the children lived with the caregiver in the month prior to arrest, and about 42 or 43% lived with the male caregiver, and that difference was statistically significant. So that's living arrangement. The last point demographically I want to make is just about the race or ethnicity of the caregivers, and we can see the pie chart on the screen. The numbers aren't there, but I'll tell you the biggest chunk of the sample was Hispanic or Latin American at 49%. Second biggest was white or Caucasian at 40%. Black was 20%, and Native American or Indian 7%. Those numbers actually add to greater than 100% because people were allowed to choose more than one. We counted them multiple times. So that's the demographic profile. Let me move on to the most, in our minds, the most important question in the research, which was about supports that children might lose when the caregiver is arrested. And we use the word might because we don't know how the cases were adjudicated, and probably some of the caregivers ended up incarcerated, others probably did not. So we don't know to what extent children actually lost these things, but we talk about it as a potential loss. So what I'm going to present are percentages of the 108 children who had been receiving various types of support from the arraigned caregiver in the month prior to the caregiver's arrest. And this table shows the different supports and the percent of children receiving that support, the highest being financial support, which has been shown in previous research, recent work, to be a really important factor. So that's not surprising at all. 87% of the children were receiving financial support. The next three, I would just want to make a note about them. The superscript A indicates that for these three, we made a judgment that they're most likely to be relevant to children of school age, which we defined as age 6 or greater, because 5-year-olds may or may not be in school yet. So we limited these results only to the portion of the sample that was age 6 or greater. But for listening or helping with personal problems, 86% of the children were receiving that support, and helping at least once a week with homework or projects, exactly the same percentage. Talking with teachers, coaches, etc., 81%, and providing transportation at least once a week, just a hair under 80%. Providing direct care and watching the child at least once a week, 74% of the children were receiving that. And government assistance, which is another form of financial support, 59% of the children were receiving. And the only one that was fairly low was providing care at least once a week for medical or special needs at 25%, probably because a lot of children don't have any specific medical or special needs at a given time. So those are the overall results, and it makes it clear that we're looking at caregivers who are, on the whole, fairly, quite involved in their children's lives. Related questions, though, are whether this potential loss differs by caregiver's gender, and the answer is not all that much. The way that we actually, let me just explain how we looked at the data. Rather than looking at support one by one, what we did was for each caregiver to determine whether they provided at least 3 of those types of support. So it's kind of a summary way of looking at the supports. And for male caregivers, 86% of them provided at least 3 types of supports to the children in the month before their arrest. For female caregivers, in the sample it was a bit higher at 96%. That difference was actually, it looks meaningful. It was not statistically significant, but the more important point is that both male and female caregivers were really pretty heavily involved. When we look at legal guardianship, it's very high for both legal guardians and non-guardians, both in the high 80s in terms of percentages. And the last way we cut up the data was by living status. And here there actually was a statistically significant difference. For caregivers that lived with the child, they were providing at least 3 supports. 100% of them provided at least 3 supports, whereas for those not living with the child, it was 77%. So that is significant, but it's still, 77% is still a pretty large percentage. So we're talking about almost no matter how you look at the data, caregivers are pretty heavily involved in their children's lives. Question 4, witnessing arrest. And the first point that I want to make here is it's good news or bad news, depending on how you look at it. Most children, 82%, did not witness the caregiver's arrest, which is good. But that means that 17.6%, which is about 19 or 20 children out of our sample, did witness the arrest, which is really an important issue because, not too surprisingly, research shows that there's significant potential for trauma if children witness a caregiver's arrest. So we projected out that in the New Britain courthouse cases, 143 children per year witnessed the caregiver's arrest, and this is an underestimate for the same reasons as we discussed before. The final point that I want to make under question 4 is about children's experiences when this happened. And we're dealing with relatively small numbers, but in our sample, 50% of the children who witnessed the arrest saw the caregiver being handcuffed. 20% reported that a gun was pointed at the caregiver, and 10% of baton. So there were, some children who saw some disturbing things. So those are our questions. Let me just quickly go through our major conclusions. And first of all, we don't have a specific number to project, but a large number of children, we're comfortable saying, in Connecticut are likely to be affected each year by the arrest of the caregiver. And a much smaller number, but still a significant number of Connecticut children witness a caregiver's arrest. We also believe that caregivers' arrests are likely to have significant effects on children's daily lives in terms of the loss of the kinds of supports that we looked at. And a final point on this slide is the negative effects on children's daily lives are likely to be substantial for both male and female caregivers. So in terms of, I mentioned earlier, we'd have some thoughts about policy. A general point is we think policies and procedures should consider the effects of arrested caregivers on children and families in a way that doesn't jeopardize public safety. And we have 2 tentative implications. One is to develop a process to assess, hopefully shortly after arrest, whether a caregiver's arrest will create needs in children's lives. And second, to identify ways of minimizing the negative impacts on children. should be identified and evaluated. And along those lines, I'll make two quick suggestions. One being something that's actually already being considered and looked at and implemented in Connecticut and some other jurisdictions, which is training law enforcement officers to understand why this issue is important and to have arrest procedures that are child friendly, that consider the arrestees' children to minimize harm. So that would be one example. Another example is at sentencing to use family impact statements or family responsibility statements to provide information to the court, which could be considered in determining what an appropriate sentence would be. So those are a couple of thoughts on policy implications of our research. And my final slide is just a acknowledgement of the CIP initiative at the Institute for Municipal and Regional Policy, and there's contact information and ways you can find out more. And that is my presentation.
So this is Erica again, and right now I'm going to be speaking about state-specific data in relation to incarcerated caregivers and their dependents. So really quickly, I just want to thank the Department of Correction for providing us with this data. It's from 2016, and I'm going to start with a basic overview that looks at a very short timeline we've started to create that looks at incarceration in Connecticut. So basically what we have is we have two data points that we've received from the Department of Corrections. In April 2016, you can see that about 54% or 53.67% of those currently incarcerated reported having at least one dependent. And this left 18,118 dependents in Connecticut with at least one caregiver behind bars. And just so you know, in April, the prison population for our state was 15,527. We were also lucky enough to receive some data for June 2016. So the numbers are very similar, but this timeline is hopefully going to continue over time. So in June, it's the same. About 54% of those incarcerated reported having at least one dependent. This left 18,034 total dependents in Connecticut with an incarcerated caregiver, and the total prison population for June was 15,322. So this next slide, you can see that there are many more incarcerated men than women who report at least one dependent, and this makes sense because there is a significantly higher number of men who are currently incarcerated. So according to both the April and June data, white women are reporting the highest number of dependents. On this PowerPoint, I've only put April 2016 data. So female caregivers are reporting 500 dependents. For June, this actually increased to 539 dependents. Next, for Black or African American women, in April, they reported 305 dependents, and this increased to 319 for June. And then Hispanic women, in April, it was 259, and this also increased in June to 286. So among the 1,073 women who were incarcerated as of June 1st, 40.4% reported having at least one dependent. So for men, again, the numbers are higher. And according to both April and June data, Black men reported having the highest number of dependents. For April, this was 7,676. And for June, this was 7,730. Hispanic men reported the second highest number of dependents. In April, this was 5,002, and in June, this was 4,952. Finally, white men in April reported 4,239 dependents, and in June, they reported 4,121 dependents. So among the 14,249 men who were incarcerated in June of 2016, 55.8% reported having at least one dependent. Now, When a working member of the family becomes incarcerated, family income typically drops on average by 22%. Furthermore, a recent study found that 65% of families with a member in prison or jail had difficulty meeting basic needs. So when a dependent lives in a single parent home and that person becomes incarcerated, there are numerous questions that arise, and these questions need to be answered in relation to the care of this child. So with all that being said, and this is April data that I'm going to be talking about, only 23% of dependents in Connecticut in April have an incarcerated caregiver who reports currently being married. Over 12,000 dependents with an incarcerated caregiver are from single-parent homes. So then we also do have some June numbers, which aren't on this slide, but according to data from June, about, again, 4,000 or 3,909 dependents come from an environment where their caregiver is married, compared to almost 13,000 dependents coming from single caregiver homes. So although we would like to separate this information by race and ethnicity, we are currently unable to do so because of the format in which the data is provided to us. And it is definitely a future goal of ours to be able to access more racially disaggregated data. So as we get it, we will absolutely be improving and updating these slides and this information. So the next data point I'm going to touch on pretty briefly is the average sentence length for those reporting and not reporting dependents. So as you can see, the average sentence length appears to be very similar. Those reporting having at least one dependent are given an average of 9.86 years, and those without a dependent are given an average sentence length of 10.07 years. Now, with this data that we were provided, we don't know the nature of the crimes that were committed, but we do know that parental incarceration can be traumatic for all involved. And so I'm just going to briefly touch on family impact statements. And we feel they're really important for judges to consider, and prosecutors and probation officers, when making sentencing or supervision decisions. These family impact statements also do not have a fiscal note. So given certain stipulations and taking into account the nature of the crime, we would really love for those professionals to make decisions that are informed by the needs of the defendant's children and by the potential effect on these youth if their parent were to be incarcerated. So really briefly, in 2009, San Francisco's probation department adopted family impact statements into their pre-sentencing investigation reports. There's also an Oklahoma state law that requires judges to ask if a convicted and sentenced individual is a single custodial parent and to inquire about child care arrangements for that child. New York has also been able to incorporate family impact statements into their pre-sentence investigation reports. And Connecticut has previously attempted to pass legislation for family impact statements. This occurred in 2014. It was SB 361, and it passed the Judiciary Committee. I believe it also passed the Senate, and it eventually died in the House. So nothing was passed or has been passed as of yet. Now I have a few more slides. This next one looks at average round trip travel time to correctional facilities. So basically, I took the 5 largest cities in Connecticut as the starting point. So Hartford, New Haven, Bridgeport, Stamford, and Waterbury. And I basically looked at average round trip travel time to all of the facilities using both public and private transportation. And it is safe to assume that travel from more rural areas of Connecticut to a correctional facility might be even more difficult or take longer if you are using public transportation. So if you're looking at this slideshow, you can see that if you're using public transportation, so your point of where you would start your transit to any correctional facility, on average, your round trip travel time would be 6.66 hours. The shortest round trip travel time by public transit would be 2 hours, and that would be if you are originating from Hartford. And by car, this round trip travel time is a lot lower, but it's still a pretty significant amount of time. So the longest would be if you would be originating from Stamford, which is about 3 hours round trip, and shortest again would be Hartford. So the next few slides are actually some really exciting June data that we received. We don't have anything from April on this, and it really looks at location, or where dependents live. So the Department of Correction provided us with a number of incarcerated individuals who report currently residing in one of these 5 largest Connecticut cities. So again, Hartford, Bridgeport, New Haven, Waterbury, and Stamford. So from that, we were able to determine that 8,621 dependents with an incarcerated caregiver are from a major Connecticut city. So that's almost 50%, and I believe it's more so about 46% of dependents. They're from, larger cities in Connecticut. And you can see the specific numbers of dependents in each city on this current slide. So just to point out, it looks like Hartford has the highest number of dependents, and then the lowest would be Stamford. And then this next slide, again from June only, we're continuing to talk about location. And though the Department of Correction was only able to provide us with limited data for this, we can assume from these slides that many families and their dependents and their loved ones are traveling to see an incarcerated caregiver. So for example, these data points for Hartford, only 16%, or 394 of the 2,422 dependents with an incarcerated caregiver in Hartford Correctional Center are also living in Hartford, Connecticut. So just to repeat what these data points mean, we also know that only 13%, or 296 of the 2,270 dependents with an incarcerated caregiver in New Haven Correctional Facility are also from New Haven. So this just kind of hints at the fact that many of these dependents will have to travel to see their incarcerated caregiver. And we have 2 more slides. So basically this just looks at, again, this is June only data. This really looks at who these caregivers are. We were able to get the age of the caregiver, and so we can see that individuals as young as 18 are claiming at least one dependent. I didn't include that in this slide because the numbers were so low. And then I also didn't include the numbers over the age of 60 who were claiming independence because they were also low. But it means that these caregivers could also be grandparents. So as you can see, the age group reporting the highest number of dependents for June are between the ages of 36 and 45. So 68% of incarcerated individuals between this age range are reporting to have at least one dependent. And then the second highest age group, as you can see, are those between 31 and 35. So 61% of individuals in this age range report at least one dependent. And then this, we can look at incarcerated male and female caregivers. So this is just a quick little infographic I made, but you can see that incarcerated men between the ages of 28 and 30 are 7 times more likely than females to report at least one dependent. The next age group would be between 31 and 35, and men are 9 times more likely than females to report at least one dependent. And then finally, between this highest age group, 36 to 45, men are 17 times more likely than females to report at least one dependent. So to close, and this was mentioned at our panel discussion, and I'll go through this quickly before we shift over to Aileen, but our whole goal in doing this is really to continue learning more about incarcerated caregivers and their dependents, or the children. And so basically what our goals are to access and collect data that continues to include cities and towns. And, now we're going to start looking for not just the largest cities. We're going to continue and start to actually speak directly to individuals impacted by parental incarceration. And for all of you who were wondering why I keep saying dependents instead of children, right now the Department of Correction does not actually collect data that asks how many children an incarcerated individual has. They ask how many dependents they have. So although we can assume that many of the dependents are children, we can't say that for sure. So that's something that we are going to be talking with the Department of Correction about. And further down the line, we'll be creating a task force, and discussions are already starting about this. And they will include state and local program and policy workers. And eventually, we plan to produce a legislative agenda and some policy recommendations that we will hopefully be able to push and possibly pass during the 2017 legislative session. So next up, we have Aileen Keys-Yeager. She is the project manager from the Connecticut Children with Incarcerated Parents Initiative. And I will pass this over to her.
As you heard, my name is Aileen Keys-Yeager. I'll be talking about how parental incarceration can affect the children left behind. I work at the Institute for Municipal and Regional Policy, which is a grant and contract funded entity that is housed at Central Connecticut State University. We primarily perform criminal justice and social justice research and public policy work. Since fiscal year 08, the IMRP has been receiving annual funding from the Connecticut General Assembly to administer competitive grants for providing positive interventions for children with incarcerated family members. The IMRP always continually seeks to gain an additional understanding of these children and other issues that we research, but these children in particular and their service needs through research, evaluation, and outreach activities, with the goal of using the various data and knowledge that we gain to inform intervention and public policy development. And through this funding, we are fortunate to be able to be Connecticut's Children with Incarcerated Parents Research Center. Today I'll be discussing what studies say about youth with incarcerated parents, what youth say about themselves, and a little bit about what you can do to help, or what we all can try to do to help. First things first, although children with incarcerated parents have a prominent shared experience, they are also a diverse group of children. So although we will be discussing generalizations here, it is important for us all to remember that children with incarcerated parents, like all humans, are all at once like all others, like some others, and like no others. So what do the studies say? I'm going to be focusing my discussion today on three primary topics. Trauma, which includes, and you'll hear why, stress and disrupted attachment, stigma, and the potential negative effect on children's well-being. Trauma is defined as an incident or event that is perceived as life-threatening to oneself or another. Studies have shown that the absence or unavailability of a parent or primary attachment figure is emotionally equivalent to children to being life-threatening. So the separation alone from a primary attachment figure can cause trauma in children. Trauma, then, as you know, causes an increase in the body's levels of adrenaline and cortisol in amounts that can actually cause brain damage, and in some laboratory tests have actually killed laboratory animals. This changes brain architecture, which then affects impulse control, cause and effect learning, predictability, emotional regulation, and reciprocal engagement. So the separation from a primary attachment figure can cause trauma. Then the trauma causes changes in the brain architecture, which then negatively impacts child development. Scientists now know that chronic, unrelenting stress in early childhood, which can be caused by the abrupt separation from caregivers, extreme poverty, or parental depression, for example, can be toxic to the developing brain in the same way as repeated abuse and witnessing violence. Stress levels significant enough to cause such disruption in brain architecture can be caused by the death of a loved one, natural disasters, parental abandonment, or perceived abandonment, which you can see clearly relates to children with incarcerated parents. A child's capacity, however, to cope with stress depends on the nature of the stressor and the attachment figure's ability to diminish or counter the effects linked to that stressor. So you can see that if a parent is removed from their child and their child is experiencing such harmful levels of stress that it really diminishes the parent's ability to actually ease their body's stress response and prevent them from further health risk. Research suggests that changes in attachment behaviors, such as the separation from a primary attachment figure, were significantly related to PTSD symptoms in children. So by removing that primary attachment figure, you're causing or potentially causing PTSD symptoms in children. And that trauma can then interfere with a child's ability to securely attach. So the separation from a primary attachment figure can cause trauma, and then that trauma can interfere with a child's ability to securely attach. However, while the loss of that primary attachment figure can cause trauma, their presence actually raises dopamine levels and lowers the dangerous levels of cortisol that the body develops during times of trauma. So the primary attachment figure actually acts as a buffer from the most damaging effects of trauma, including the trauma of that separation. In terms of stigma, as you can imagine, families feel forced to hide the fact that they have a loved one incarcerated for their fear of judgment from others, which then leads them to withhold information about what's going on in their life, which unfortunately then leads to their avoidance of making positive connections that could actually provide the healing supports that many families could benefit from. What's interesting is that when people think of children's shame for having a parent incarcerated, they tend to believe it's over the embarrassment over their parent's crime or the imprisonment. But when you actually ask the children, they say that they feel ashamed because of the reactions of us, the body language and the words that we use when talking to them, we being their peers, their teachers, their coaches, social workers, therapists, pastors, and mentors, feels judgmental to them. So again, it could be our body language, and it can be, of course, the words that we use when we respond to children that bring this up. Or if we know it's the elephant in the room and the adults aren't discussing it with them in a supportive manner, then it can still feel judgmental to them because they could assume the reason you're not discussing it is because you're uncomfortable, because you're judging them and their family. This silence leads some children to lie about their parent in order to avoid the judgments of others, which again then prevents them from connecting with others and receiving the much needed support that others could provide, which again leaves them suffering in silence for fear of judgment and mistreatment by others. This, of course, exacerbates the suffering children are already experiencing due to the sudden loss of their caregiver. It's a public health issue. I mean, we've heard from others prior to me, and then of course through this, that there are some serious health consequences for children that are experiencing this, and it needs to start being looked at in that manner. The CDC Kaiser Permanente Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, which many of you may have heard of, it's one of the largest investigations of childhood abuse and neglect and then later life health and well-being that's been performed to date. And through that research, having an incarcerated household member has now been identified as an adverse childhood experience, which means that having that experience as a child is likely to cause negative health consequences in childhood and potentially throughout one's entire lifetime. It is, however, distinguished from other ACEs because of its unique combination of trauma, stigma, and shame. Another study that has demonstrated the link between the experience of having an incarcerated loved one and negative health outcomes demonstrated that when demographics, socioeconomic status, and familial characteristics were controlled for, so not factored in, they were controlled for, parental incarceration was independently associated with learning disabilities, attention deficit disorder, and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, behavioral or conduct problems, developmental delays, and speech and language problems. As the author stated in her report, Kristen Turney was the author, results of the study suggest that children's health disadvantages are an overlooked and unintended consequence of mass incarceration in this country. Interestingly, from one study, another recent study suggests that families that were able to maintain regular contact during incarceration were less likely to experience negative health impacts associated with incarceration. So that's really important as we look towards policy and practice changes in this state. So what do the kids say? Just last week, I was fortunate to be invited to attend a national listening session on children with incarcerated parents in D.C. that was hosted jointly by the Federal Interagency Reentry Council Subgroup on Children of Incarcerated Parents and the Interagency Working Group on Youth Programs. During the two-day event, we listened to CIP from across the country discuss their experiences and what they would like to see changed to lessen the suffering of other CIPs. During the event, one CIP asked us, the youth chaperones and the federal agency representatives that were in attendance, to close our eyes for a brief visualization. So I would ask you to do the same at this moment if you could. Please, just for a moment, if you could close your eyes and picture a time during your childhood when you were with a parent that you trusted and loved and you felt things were happy. It could be a birthday party, a holiday, or just sitting on the couch watching a movie with them. So keep that image in your mind just for a moment. And now if you could please imagine that that person is suddenly ripped away from you and that happiness and security is gone. Imagine how you would have felt in that aftermath. The panic, the fear, the anger. Her intent, of course, with this brief activity was to demonstrate that the feeling for CIPs is no different than it would be for us, which I think leads us to a challenge. For all of us to approach this issue as we would want it to have been approached if either our parent was taken away from us when we were children or us that was removed from our children's lives today. How would you want either you as a child treated or your children treated tomorrow if today you were incarcerated? Typical feelings for children who have a parent incarcerated. Due to time, I don't want to go too much into detail. I want to leave time for questions and answers. So many children are afraid. They're afraid of being abandoned, of never seeing their parents again that were removed, and also very afraid of being taken away from their remaining caregiver. They worry a lot about their parents' well-being, and they also worry oftentimes about their caregivers, especially if it's an elderly caregiver, a grandparent that's caring for them. They're confused. They don't know where their parent is. They don't know the trajectory of the case, oftentimes, particularly during that pretrial phase. And what they're not told, they're going to fill in the blanks with some negative assumptions. So when they're not told the truth, they're going to assume and picture the worst. They obviously feel sadness and despair. Interestingly, many feel guilt that either they were not enough to prevent the behavior that caused the arrest, and or guilt due to a false association that the child may have made between their behavior and the arrest. One child recently, I heard the story where he had come home late on his bicycle, and while he was gone on his bike ride, his father was arrested. And he made an association between him being late and not coming home when his father told him to his father being arrested, which of course does not make sense as an adult, but when you're a child, you make those sorts of assumptions. And so there's a lot of guilt associated with it too. And then certainly loneliness and isolation. Loneliness from missing their parent, to also the isolation as a result of stigma and fear of stigmatization and mistreatment and being judged, which results in isolation. And then anger at the incarcerated parent at times, but also at the police, even if the arrest was done smoothly, and then anger in general for the situation that they're going through. What do the kids say? Just like other kids, children with incarcerated parents say that they want their parent. They miss their parent, they want their parent, they feel secure with their parent. Again, these are generalizations, but most often that is what I hear. They want to not be judged. They want support while they go through this. They want stability. They definitely want honesty. And many just also want the opportunity to be a kid. They also want more supportive programs so that they can get that support and access that support. I hear a lot talk about wanting their teachers to be trained in how to respond to them and treat them, because when this does get brought into the schools, whether it be by a parent letting the school know that this is happening or by a child that has a breakdown in the classroom and they reveal what is going on in their life, teachers don't know how to respond, don't know how to handle it, because of course they haven't been trained in it. And so it's a missed opportunity where children feel like they wish they were able to get that support from their teachers, but their teachers don't know how to respond, and so they are not responded to well. They also definitely want COs, corrections officers, to be trained, as they feel like when they go to visit, they're treated very negatively and aggressively, even if it's just by the demeanor, how it can be interpreted by children, but certainly how they're spoken to and how they're treated while they're there. They want to be accepted whatever stage they are at in their coping, treated again with respect and not like a criminal. And they also want preparation for and support during their parents' reentry, which can be a really traumatic time for the family, sometimes more so than earlier stages in the incarceration process. Youth also reference the Children with Incarcerated Bill of Rights, which I'll go through very briefly. One, right to be kept safe and informed at the time of their parents' arrest, to be heard when decisions are made about the child, to be considered when decisions are made about their parent, which would certainly be family impact statements, to be well cared for in their parent's absence, to speak with, see, and touch their parent, to support as they struggle with their parents' incarceration, to not be judged, again, blamed, or labeled because of their parents' incarceration, and the right to a lifelong relationship with their parent. So how can you help? Real brief. Practice self-reflection. We need to check for biases in ourselves, and if those biases might be influencing our body language, our perceptions of that parent or that family, our interactions with youth and their family, and our decisions. It needs to be an ongoing practice to ensure that our biases are not unjustly impacting our approach to children and their families. Some good questions to ask yourself: do I believe a person could be a good parent that is involved with the criminal justice system? Do I believe that parents should remain a constant presence in that child's life during their incarceration? Do I believe that parent may actually know what is best for that child despite the fact that they're incarcerated? And how do I feel when a child says, I want to be like my daddy when I grow up, and you know that that dad is in prison? We all have biases, and it's important to constantly check in with ourselves to determine whether we are letting our biases influence our interactions, perceptions, or decisions unjustly. Oh, excuse me. It is also important to listen to children. I won't go on. I know we're running out of time, and I want to provide opportunities for questions. Certainly respect and support children's feelings about their parent and their caregiver, support their relationship with their incarcerated parent, allow CIP to be kids. A lot of times they have to take on added responsibility because of that absent parent, and it prevents them from allowing to be kids, and certainly just the stress and the emotional burden that they now carry prevents them from being able to just be kids. So it's important to try and find opportunities to allow them to be children. Again, honesty. Also, to design programs and policies specifically with CIP needs in mind, and design those programs and policies with the input of children with incarcerated parents, because nobody knows them better than they do. To commit to the Bill of Rights, and again, just to be there in a non-judgmental way. Heard that repeatedly. For additional information on children with incarcerated parents, or for training or technical assistance, please reach out to our initiative. We're happy to help. We have recently uploaded on our website a FAQ booklet that we're constantly updating, so please access the booklet, review it. Hopefully it's helpful. If you have any suggestions for new questions or for changes to answers, please let us know. It's going to be constantly changing and updating. And you'll have access to these PowerPoints. So please feel free to review these other links. There's some wonderful information on all of them. And then, of course, my contact information if anybody wants to reach out to me directly or link with us on Twitter. So I'll pass it back to our host, and we'll be happy to take questions. Thank you, everybody.
Hi everyone, it's Erica again. So I know we're coming up on the 3 o'clock hour, so I understand if you all need to go because we did say this was going to be an hour. We're just going to scan through a couple of questions, and we did actually have a lot of engagement, so thank you for that. So some of the first questions are going to be for Aileen, and if we can't answer them right now, and if we don't get to some of the questions that you have asked, we will absolutely be, still type them in, and we will definitely answer them. So some of the first questions were about the New Britain Courthouse study. So I will state what the question is, and we're going to pass it over to Aileen to answer. So first of all, one question was, how many of the interviewers in the New Britain study were of the same race or ethnic language spoken of the populations? And then the second one was, what is a non-contact interview? So I'll pass that over to Aileen.
Hi, thank you.
Oh, she's on.
Oh, you can. The interviewers, no, I know this was not the question, but the interviewers were all female, which I do think is maybe important to note, because that is certainly completely absent of an entire population of potential male interviewers. But we did have both Caucasian and Black African American interviewers and Latina, Hispanic. We also had bilingual interviewers. However, no interviewer or interviewee, excuse me, requested a Spanish-speaking interview. So we did have a good representation in terms of race, ethnicity of our interviewers, although on each day only one would go. And it really depended on schedules, who was available when we did learn from the courthouse that we had somebody that wanted to be interviewed. In terms of a non-contact interview, the interview room was set up much like a prison visiting room for a non-contact visit. There was the glass partition in between the interviewer and the interviewee, and then information was actually taped to the glass so that the interviewee could read along to the consent form and the questions as they were answering, but they were separated by a glass partition. Thank you for both questions.
So we have some more questions for you, Aileen. The next one we have is, do you have a unique count, especially since the majority of the prison population is African American and Latino?
And I wasn't sure what unique count is referring to. My guess is that maybe instead of percentages, it was asking for hard numbers.
Yeah.
We do have that. Is that what you think it is? I could send, when we post the information, I can post the report, and I'll verify that those hard numbers are in there. But I do believe that the numbers are in the report itself. The report is also posted on our website at ctcip.org under publications and then IMRP, so you can access it that way as well.
So one more question for you. Somebody said that they found it very interesting that men were the greater percentage of caregivers in the New Britain study. Do you know if they were relatives or who they were in relation to the child?
So when we asked caregivers, we asked the interviewees if they were eligible to participate. We asked if they provided regular care to children within the month prior to their arrest. So that who was eligible to participate in the interview. We have, so I don't think we have information on whether they were uncles or boyfriends, but I can check. That again would be in the report. But yeah, I don't think we captured whether they were distant relatives, but it would be in the report, so we can look at that.
Okay, so the next few questions I believe are mainly for me, but Aileen, please feel free to jump in. So one question was basically if we have any plans to share this with DOC individuals. So we actually had Commissioner Semple at our panel discussion. We have been speaking with him as well as various people in DOC. We have a meeting set up with him and several other people at the DOC in conjunction with DCF in a few days. So they have given us their support, and they are very willing to continue working with us to learn more about these dependents and these children who do have incarcerated parents or caregivers. Aileen, did you want to add anything?
No, I think that's it. I think they were there for the presentation at the Capitol when we first revealed these numbers, and then we do have a follow-up meeting with them, and we are intending to work with them long-term on this issue. And luckily, we're very fortunate to have a wonderful commissioner who's interested in this topic and who is bringing a team to our meeting with him in a couple weeks. So I really am seeing wonderful, promising signs that we're going to be able to work with them long-term in a wonderful way.
Okay, thanks. And then the next question was, to what do you anticipate the higher number of white women as mothers, and then the age of women? So first of all, the data that we received from the Department of Correction, the age data, which I'm actually looking through right now, which is the higher number of white women as mothers. So first of all, we have a higher population of white individuals throughout Connecticut. So even though there are a higher number of white women who are reporting a higher number of dependents, it kind of goes along with the percentages of white individuals in comparison to Hispanic and Black individuals. So even though we do have a higher number of white dependents who are impacted by an incarcerated caregiver, when you compare it to the individuals who are actually not in prison and who are in prison, whites are still actually underrepresented in prison. And I don't have the numbers in front of me, but for the panel discussion, I actually looked at how Hispanic individuals and African American individuals were represented, and they are still overrepresented in prison compared to not being in prison. Anything that you'd like to add, Aileen?
No, I think that's good. Thank you.
Okay, and then let's see. The presenter stated that they. So, do you know if you can speak to the Aileen? Somebody says that the presenter stated that the interviewees were allowed to be counted more than once. Do you know what that question may be speaking to?
I'm sorry, I don't. The
That's okay.
interviewees were allowed to be counted more than once.
Yeah, so Jim might have mentioned that, and unfortunately, he had to I believe, teach a class. um, so we can ask him about that, but he's not currently online.
Yeah, they were. So I could make guesses. I would think we only performed the interviews obviously one time, and it's when they were there for their arraignment for their current charge. And it was, a daily thing. We'd get a call from the courthouse. They'd let us know if there was anybody there that had been arrested that was being held for their arraignment. And then we would go down to the courthouse to interview them. My assumption might be that he was referring to more broad numbers, that maybe, or maybe if it was a male and female that were arrested together and they're being interviewed separately about children, so the children maybe were counted more than once. But yeah, we could certainly follow up with Jim and see if he has a better clarification.
Yeah, more people are saying, so he stated that interviewees were able to select more than one race. I think he said that they could identify as more than one race. So he allowed people to list themselves in one or more ethnic groups. So maybe that's why they were counted more than, they could have been counted more than once.
Yes, I would. That's correct.
Okay, so I believe that is all of the questions we have received. If we missed any while I'm scrolling through this, please feel free to contact Aileen or I. And like I said, we will be sending out PowerPoints. We will be sending out this presentation. Sorry for the few kinks that we did have at the beginning. And if you have any questions,